Good afternoon, everyone. Hope y'all are having a good week. It does seem like as we're kind of moving through this semester, it seems to be going faster and faster, and people are getting more and more tired. So just try to stay on top of things and keep up with everything. It will make your life much easier, I promise. All right, so we'll just go ahead and do our general reminders for today. Quiz 6 is due on Sunday at its normal time. If y'all have any issues with it, please let me know. I have received just about everybody's connecting with biology assignment. I have about 250 more of them to grade, so Katie and I are going to be trying to work through as many of those as possible. Do remember that if you resubmitted it to me after Wednesday, I just don't have time to look at it. I'm sorry. Y'all had it available for a month, and I did try to make that offer available, but it's just hard to, especially when it's that close to like the due date. We just have too many of them coming in. Don't forget too that your exam is coming up soon. It's next Friday. And as we've kind of mentioned multiple times, this is a pretty dense test, right? I'm sure you all have noticed this as you're doing some of the quizzes. And that's okay. You might struggle a little bit. That's perfectly fine. It's just harder material. So what that means is you need to be on top of studying and take advantage of extra credit opportunities. There may or may not be more coming later for the almost exact same style, if not something a little bit different, so bear with me. So something we will do on the Wednesday before the exam is we'll have a review. Remember to please bring your exam questions or questions that you have before the exam in, just so that way if you have them, we can get them answered. Just in case those of y'all that can't make it to office hours or things, if we're done in like 10 minutes, we'll cut class early so y'all can go home and study. Is that a fair deal? Now, if you don't feel comfortable, bringing your questions up to the front or whatever, feel free to shoot me an email. One, I'll probably respond to you almost immediately, but more than likely there are a ton of people that also have that same question. So it's not a bad thing, and I'm happy to talk about it in this class as well. Before we get started formally with today's lecture, does anybody have any questions about anything going on? As far as the extra credit for exam 2 goes, I'll do the formal description of everything on Friday, just to let all the people that aren't coming to lecture know what's up. But in the meantime, for those of y'all that are already working on it, I saw that we have 60 people that have already attempted it at least, with some like 200 different species of things observed for like almost 500 observations. So that's really cool. This data is actually really valuable too. And I did kind of change how it's counted and everything, so that way it's not going to include my crap in there. It's just going to be what y'all post, which is really cool to see. And some of y'all post some really neat things, everything from moose to dolphins and manatees, and somebody had a little rescued great horned owl that was really cute. So take advantage of it. If you have cool stuff, show it off. What's up? Yeah. So obviously, if you can, try to stick with stuff that you're finding around right now. And honestly, for instance, like the animal stuff is really easy. You can walk from my office in the biology building to here, so about a 5-minute walk, and see at least 10 to 15 brown anoles or gray squirrels and all that kind of fun stuff. So it's pretty easy to knock out just in like, I think I did it in like 5 minutes one day just to test it. But yeah, if you have older pictures, especially cool ones, that's not necessarily a bad thing either. Yes. No, so your observations don't have to be of unique critters. And what I mean by that is it can't be just the same picture of the same animal over and over and over again within 5 minutes. But if you see something in the same general spot, you're more than allowed to use that again and again. So say, for instance, you find a squirrel in one place one day and one place the other day, both of those observations are totally valid, because it's really important to talk about when animals are occurring in very specific locations. So do remember the location stuff is important and the date and time stuff is important, because if you know what time it is and what day it is and conditions, when things are more likely to show up in places compared to when they're not. For instance, with like frogs and toads, they're going to be out when it's raining or like right before sunset. So if you find one then, it's important to note that. So that way, you know, one, you can find it again later, and two, it lets everybody else know when those animals are coming out. Yes. So for this exam, it's everything since the previous. Keep in mind too that it's not technically a cumulative exam, so it doesn't include anything officially from that previous chapter or that previous section, but there are things that do cross over, right? So, yeah, so anything post test 1 is fair game. So any of the like microbial stuff, biological systems, organ systems, all that stuff's fair game. And if, by the way, if y'all ever have any questions on what the test, when the test is, what's on it, all that kind of fun stuff, if you've ever looked on web courses, there's a file just below your syllabus that's posted in that course information module that has a thing called schedule. It tells you where you're when you're connecting with biology assignments are due, when your exams are due, what chapters to read, what chapters are going to be on the test, all that kind of fun stuff is in there. So maybe read the syllabus. Anyways, so let's go ahead and get started. Today, we're going to be talking about the digestive and the urinary systems. This is chapter 28 in your book. So what exactly are these for, and why are we, again, pairing them up, right? So the digestive system is there to break down nutrients into food and eliminate solid waste of species, whereas the urinary system is there to eliminate water-soluble waste and determine the volumes and compositions of body fluids. So in other words, all of these things are here to help regulate the homeostasis of those cells by providing nutrients when it needs it, moving away crap that it doesn't need, literally, as well as getting rid of excess water and all that kind of fun stuff too. Ultimately, like I just said, the digestive system is there to maintain the homeostasis of nutrients. Now, obviously, nutrients that we need to live and, you know, be able to exist as a person and continue our lives and reproduce and all that kind of fun stuff are found in the food we eat, right? Now, in order to do that and get those nutrients from it, we need to break it down and then ultimately deliver those nutrients to the blood to be able to pass around to all those other cells. Now, the circulatory system is going to help deliver those nutrients to cells through the entire body, like we kind of mentioned a little bit on Monday. So just keep that in mind. Now, the urinary system is there primarily to maintain the homeostasis of bodily fluids. The kidneys in particular are there to produce urine and excrete nitrogenous waste, which in humans is in the form of urea, and regulate water levels and electrolyte levels. In other words, there's basically a bunch of filters inside of your kidneys that get rid of the excess water that you don't need, as well as getting rid of a lot of those other mineral and nitrogenous waste solutes that just need to get out of your body. Now, digestive systems often reflect the kind of diet that an organism is going to use. So for instance, birds that eat food, these birds are going to eat the food that they can find in their environment, and thus their digestive system is going to reflect that. For instance, when you're talking about large mammals, right, like cows or horses or what have you, they often have multi-chambered stomachs to be able to take a longer time to break down plant matter. Because plant matter has things like cellulose in it, which takes more time to break down. So if you have more and more space in your digestive system for all that stuff to sit and go through a lot of extended processes, it allows you to get more out of that resource than you would have otherwise, which is why cows can eat grass and we can't. Now, ultimately, the adaptations for each of these birds are going to reflect its diet and its availability of water and essential ions and many other selective forces. So for instance, when it comes to penguins, they don't need to drink straight water. Something like this roadrunner is going to be much more likely to conserve all the extra water that's getting because it's not getting water. Now, the digestive system is going to derive energy and materials from food. Ultimately, for instance, both humans, in this case, as well as the baby chick birds, have to ingest food, break it down, absorb those small nutrient molecules, and then eliminate what they don't need. In this case, those animals are called heterotrophs. These are organisms that consume food to obtain carbon and energy. Again, this is kind of something we touched on in that first unit. Even though it's not technically comprehensive, these things do overlap. Ultimately, this food is the source of nutrients. So animals use the nutrients in food to fuel cellular respiration and build their tissues. These nutrients are also required for things like metabolism. So in other words, keeping your body at a particular temperature, as well as growth, maintenance, and repair. And ultimately, the ability to have like your generations continue on, right? Think about it from this perspective. When you're talking about whether it be a snake that's getting ready to lay a bunch of eggs or humans going through pregnancy, that requires so much more additional energy input, right? All that stuff is important. Now, ultimately, we're going to need a wide variety of different things from the food that we obtain. But pretty much everything else is just all your other body systems is therefore just obtaining water and obtaining oxygen. And typically, we need our carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, vitamins, and minerals primarily through this process, although we can pick up water this way as well. Now, nutrients contain a bunch of different important resources. As we talked about, they kind of come in the form of like carbohydrates, proteins, and whatever, but we can then break these down even further to generate ATP, break them down into more simple sugars. So these chemical building blocks are used to build the animal's body, including simple sugars, fatty acids, amino acids, nucleotides, water, vitamins, minerals. So friends, if you remember back to the third or fourth lecture, where we talked about, very simple sugars becoming polysaccharides, the way the lipids in other words, your body has to go through the process of obtaining those lipids, those carbohydrates, all that stuff, breaking it down to its most simple form, and then repackaging it to where it can. For instance, this is something that comes up a lot with particularly vegetarianism in humans, because basically there's 2 or 3 amino acids that humans cannot produce on their own. And in order for us to make those kinds of proteins and not die of some sort of protein misformation, find those sources of protein, those sources of acids in other ways. Often this is a little more prevalent in the beef, pork, poultry, all that kind of stuff. But it means that if you're going to be vegetarian, you have to think about what kinds of food you're eating, especially because those amino acids are readily available. Now, the metabolic rate is going to determine how much animals need. And remember back to we were talking about that homeostasis makeup, right? Endotherms versus ectotherms. Warm-blooded versus cold-blooded, right? Well, if you're endothermic, things like birds, mammals, tuna, leatherback sea turtles, and a bunch of other things, they're going to need to consume more food because a lot more of that energy is just being produced or being used to produce general body heat and allow them to maintain that much higher body temperature. Whereas ectothermic animals are going to not need that as often and can go much longer without food, right? I'm sure if you've ever had a friend that had a snake or something like that, or a lizard or what have you, they can often go weeks at a time sometimes without eating. Humans can't do that. We go about 3 to 4 weeks and we die. And the reason for that is humans need all that. Whereas the snake is just going to use the external environmental temperature to kind of regulate its body temperature. Now, physiological states also affect metabolism. For instance, if you're going through massive growth spurts or going through a reproductive cycle, you're going to need more energy and more nutrients to supply and maintain that body than if you were just as a general adult, right? Think about it from this perspective. How many times have we all heard the term like growing boy or growing girl, like in reference to how much somebody is eating? That's not like a joke. That's a real thing. You put like a 14-year-old boy in a room with a shit ton of food, more than likely going to be alive. Once you get to like your early 20s, all of a sudden you can literally feel your digestive system slowing down. And you realize that you just can't eat as much anymore. You just can't function off of all that nutrients anymore. It's definitely odd. Same goes for reproduction. Baby animals often have ravenous appetites because they need to go through a lot of nutrients in order to grow. Humans are a lot more of a slow growing species. If you think about it, it takes us like 18 to 20 years to fully sexually mature would be adults, right? Things like white-tailed deer, possums, a lot of just the native U.S. wildlife, they can go from being born to completely on their own in less than a year. And as a result, they're, how quickly they're growing, their growth rate is going to be massive compared to even a human. Or a really good example of this is sea turtles. Sea turtles have a massive growth rate for their first years. Now, a varied diet, especially in humans, is important for good health. I'm not saying that you shouldn't be vegetarian or vegan or whatever. Just make sure you're getting all the proper nutrients, all the proper amino acids, all that. Take care of yourself, make sure you're eating properly. That goes for whether you eat just meat too. It's really easy to get fat, especially on processed foods, because it's missing a lot of things, and all it is just like a lot of sugar and a lot of fats, right? We have to think about the macronutrients which are required, things like water, carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids, as well as those micronutrients, kind of like what we were talking about in plants, right? All those very small amounts of vitamins and minerals. Now, a strong varied diet can prevent vitamin deficiency. So in the U.S. government, there's a bunch of food guidelines that emphasize very specific foods to eat, all that kind of fun stuff. But some things that can happen if you're not paying attention to these. Scurvy, which is always one of my favorite ones to talk about, because everybody thinks of like pirates, right? What was happening is they were going out on ships for long periods of time and not getting fresh food. They were just getting the stale, basically a cracker called hardtack, and that was all they were eating, maybe occasionally fish. And it was as a result, and next to vitamin C in your diet, that was what was causing all these weird deformities, thumb bleeding, weight loss, just general fatigue. And so a lot of that kind of stuff can happen if you're not paying attention to these things. Vitamin A, if you're not careful, if you have way too little of it, can lead to things like blindness, impaired immune function. Vitamin D causes a lack of skeletal deformities, things like rickets. Now, we don't really usually see these diseases anymore in modern day because it's incredibly acceptable to have food that you need in the right kinds of nutrients. Now it's more of just making that active decision of what you're going to eat and what you shouldn't. Ultimately, things like the Harvard School of Public Health suggest that the diet should minimize things like dairy, red meats, and starch, processed grains. So that's anything that has a lot of high sugar content, sort of thing.
You know, a lot of dairy substitutes like tofu that actually have amino acids from.
I'm not sure. So if you ask you some of the substitutions, and you guys, it just kind of depends. Things like Impossible Burger, right? They're probably more unhealthy than burger because of the amount of processed fat that's in it. So definitely look into boxes and things. Yeah. Unfortunately, I couldn't definitively say one way or the other. Now, ultimately, body weight reflects food intake and activity level. In the grand scheme of things, calories in, calories out should be roughly equal to your body weight, right? If you want to gain, you need to increase your calories in compared to your calories out, or vice versa. Now, a healthy diet includes all of those nutrients necessary to sustain life, plus whatever calories in to be able to actually burn as energy. And at the same time, this calorie content of food must balance out that body's metabolic rate and your activity level to maintain what your general homeostasis. BMI is one way to look at both your measure of height and weight to kind of see approximately where you should be. I'm going to caution you to avoid really trusting that too much because the BMI in particular, as it's currently formulated, is kind of shitty. Basically, what happened is it's been set like 50 years ago, and it doesn't really account for particularly people that are wider framed, so broader muscle or broader shoulders, that sort of thing. So technically, my BMI says I should be 170. I look like skin and bones at the moment. So for context, like it can be pretty off compared to your body type and things like that. So it's a general guideline. Don't trust it 100%. So obviously, starvation is a lot of different ways. Obviously, famine is something that we see worldwide, but you just don't have it. So you have a total lack of just available food resources. Unfortunately, it tends to affect pretty much young people. Now, the good news, somewhere in the neighborhood of between 80 and 90%, we've dramatically decreased not the lack of food, but the ability to get them certain things. So, for instance, government wars or kind of what's going on like Afghanistan, or government that's kind of helping. That's where you're more likely to see those kinds of things. You can also have some mental health disorders that can also feed into this. So you can have, but this is pretty much typically found in more affluent communities. So, or in parts of the U.S. or Europe, what have you, where basically it's a self-imposed starvation. So be careful of that too. And obviously, you get things like obesity, which is way too many calories. So the calorie intake is consistently exceeding your calories spent. All of those extra calories get converted into lipid fat cells throughout the rest of your body. For instance, with these mice, they hormonally control their diet. In other words, they hormonally messed with their ability to perceive how full they were. And as a result, this poor mouse is having a really rough day. He's a little chubby. But so what's kind of cool is obviously this clearly is not just a human issue. And so there's been a lot of push, say, in the last 10 years when it comes to zoos and pets and those sorts of things to be very cognizant of this. And what looks healthy for one species may not look healthy for another. For instance, a lot of big constrictors, your pythons, your boa, anacondas. We used to think that them being super plump was how they should be. Well, it turns out, just by feeding them different diets, a lot of that plumpness that we saw wasn't their muscles that were specifically, it was a lot more fat cells. By switching them from a primarily insect or reptile-based diet, switching them to mammals with processed fats and things, your body makeup to where they were. And as a result, we see, particularly of animals that have been around for the last 10 years or so, massive fatty livers and all this kind of fun stuff that's dramatically shortening their lifespans. Kind of unfortunate. So just like humans, you have to be kind of cognizant, especially how much do you do? Last thing you want to do is not too much, and the next thing you know, it's a little sad, but I like to make that point. Let's do a quick question here. So once a week, Mary goes out and runs before school. She burns approximately 330 calories per run. On the days that she runs, she treats herself to a milkshake, which is roughly 290 calories instead of tea, which is usually only 0. So assuming everything else in her diet is the same on those days, how will her weight change? This one should be pretty straightforward, right? Is she going to slowly gain weight? No, right, because she's still losing calories overall, even though she's still getting that. It's going to get a much slower rate. So here is correct, because even though she's still, burning off that extra 330 calories, she's still taking in enough that it's only really burning about 60. So a lot of this stuff has to be thought about when you're kind of planning your diet, your health regime, all this kind of fun stuff. Get started on it now, so it makes your life easier. Because it sucks to try to figure that out when you're like 28, 29, or in your 40s even, Now, like I kind of mentioned earlier, most animals have very specialized digestive tracts. Diets are different based off of the differences in animal digestive tracts. So herbivores are obviously going to primarily only eat plants. Carnivores are going to eat animals. Detritivores are going to eat decomposing organic matter, often known as scavengers as well. And then finally, omnivores are going to eat a broad variety of foods. One thing I kind of want to point out, and it's the most useless organism on the planet. Not kidding.
that the giant panda is one of the dumbest and most useless organisms. And I have a legitimate reason for it. So, bears are evolved to eat meat, right? Decided that it was going to move for whatever ungodly reason. In addition to that, it's not just bamboo in general, it's the tiny little things that occur as like a segment. So if you've ever looked at a piece of bamboo, it's like this fibrous, cottony looking thing. That's what it is. It actually processes the bamboo itself. So, I personally hate pandas. They're a terrible symbol for conservation. You can do everything in the world trying to get them to breed.
And they're like the most weirdly underdesigned, awful thing when it comes to evolution. They should not exist.
But as I point out, evolution isn't based off of survival of the best thing, right? It's survival of what works best at that time. So for whatever fucking reason, the bears evolved in the mountains of China for over 5 million years ago, and now the conditions that are prevalent are just not advantageous for them. For a lot of different reasons.
But mostly because they're a stupid bear that decided to eat things it shouldn't. Also, another good one to think about, insectivores, primarily insects, right? All this stuff is pretty straightforward.
Now, acquiring nutrients is a 4-step process. You're going to have digestion, where your food is going to enter the digestive tract, primarily through the mouth, and that's usually where you're going to get some of the initial chemical and mechanical breakdown of things. You're going to then have digestion, which can occur both in the mouth and the stomach, for mechanical, as well as chemical, where that's going to occur in the mouth, stomach, and small intestines. So mechanical, when it comes to digestion, is usually where just the food is being broken down physically into smaller particles, things like chewing, or when it comes to your stomach will actually move and kind of contract to break things down, right? And then when it comes to the chemical stuff, that's saliva in your mouth, right? That's then it was just modified saliva. Things like Gila monsters and snakes, all that kind of fun stuff.
Took the basic blueprints for saliva, ramped it up to 100, and decided now we're going to kill things with it.
And of course, things like in the small intestines, where you're going to have some smaller enzymes and stuff to help break food down. Yes.
Is it true that like pineapples have like an enzyme that don't react? Is it like dangerous?
Not necessarily. Yes. Are there certain foods that have inhibitory enzymes that can make things down? And yes, and use the example of pineapple. Pineapple is a great one. But there's a lot of different foods out there that have anti-digestive qualities to the enzymes that are present in them. We can help those because they're systems. But sometimes we can just add an enzyme issues too. For instance,
If you're lactose intolerant, right? It's often because you're missing a particular enzyme that's helping you to break down lactose into a smaller, more simple sugar to be able to process it.
usually when it comes to being lactose intolerant, it's just the urine, or at least from your udder, that have that ability. However, that's kind of, it can be like independent, so it's not necessarily, it's a pretty simple population.
So it just kind of depends. So think about it too. Humans, even though, you know, we think of ourselves as being a positive beyond a lot of it, we're not, that we're still kind of undergoing change as a result of things in our environment, as well as the way that humans in particular have a really cool ability to adapt to things that are culturally changing. And they can interact with each other. For instance, people that are kind of, this is, I forget exactly which example this came out of, but there is examples of people that have gone through major traumatic instances in their life, whether through slavery or through prisoner of war camps, that sort of thing. And as a result, their body does epigenetic changes to their genome, which basically all that means is you're kind of changing what gets expressed and what doesn't get expressed. So for instance, if you're going through massive starvation periods, say something like the have access to food, your body's going to be more likely to have the epigenetic genes turned on to be able to retain all that food and all those calories more likely and fat as quickly as possible than those that aren't necessarily in that situation. And so you can have these effects happen generations down the road too, because those epigenetic effects are often passed down as well. So these slight changes in your environment in a specific period of time can influence your genome and potentially your offspring down the road. So, and there's been a lot of really interesting studies on this with humans in particular, just because it's easier to track major famines, major issues, as other socio-political issues, that sort of thing. I'm going to warn you now, we probably won't get through all this today, so bear with me. All right. Then finally, absorption, which is where all that stuff is processed and brought into the bloodstream, and elimination, which is getting rid of all the extra crap that you don't need. Now, digestion again is going to occur primarily just when your whatever animal or plant or whatever is taking food into the digestive tract. So generally in animals, when we eat, they feel hungry. And so by putting food in the mouth, that kind of helps satiate that a little bit. And there's particular chemical signals in your brain that are designed to react to the processes of chewing and all that kind of fun stuff. That's why things like gum help to make you feel less hungry, right? Because even if you're not actually eating it, it's putting on those same things that are telling your body, hey, you're eating something. You're going to be okay. And then the digestion is going to begin in the mouth and continue into the stomach and ultimately into the small intestines. So the chewing in your mouth and then the stomach churning is going to help break down food mechanically, while the enzymes are going to chemically break down molecules into smaller subunits. You're then going to get to absorption, which is where nutrients move into the bloodstream. Those nutrients are going to enter the cell lining of the large and small intestines, primarily the small intestines, and then move into the blood, which transports them throughout the body. And ultimately, anything that you don't need is going to be eliminated from the body, usually as feces, which are solid waste. And often they're a mixture of the bacteria that helped you break down that food, as well as any undigested food that didn't get processed. So, great example of this is corn, right? You know when you've eaten corn. But the reason for that is because the chemical structure for the outside of that corn kernel is just something we can't break down. That's why it just passes right through. A little gross, but that's how it works, right? Now, intracellular digestion is completed inside of cells. So for instance, fungus, which is primarily where we're going to find this, are the only animals that lack a specialized body cavity for digesting food. They're the ones that don't have true tissue, right? So as a result, they have things called collar cells, which line the interior body wall of the sponge and take in nutrients and enclose the food in a food backboard. The very, very specialized system. I think it's a very, very weird little organism. Maybe weird is not the right word, or little is not the right word, rather. Now, this food vacuole is going to fuse with the lysosome, and digestive enzymes are going to be there to break down any of those food molecules. But there's also extracellular digestion, which is completed outside of the cells in the digestive system. So, for instance, in a lot of animals, digestion occurs in specialized compartments outside of the cells, such as the hydrous gastrovascular cavity. So right down here. And that digestive tract contains enzymes that are going to be there to help break down food. Now, these cells lining that digestive cavity are going to be also there to absorb nutrients. So in other words, they have a bunch of specialized cells here. Some of them are down whatever they capture, others are going to help absorb what they eat and get rid of it. Now, these digestive tracts can be complete or incomplete. Now, if it's incomplete, that means it only has one organ. It's like a flatworm or that pattern that we just showed. Everything goes in and out of the same organ. It's not like it's pooping out of its mouth, right? It's not just getting rid of the excess stuff. It's not as developed as we think of the human digestive system. And then you have a complete digestive system. This is usually done through what we call the alimentary canal or the gastrointestinal tract.
and has two openings, a mouth and an anus. Now, you usually didn't see this until the advent of the coelom, which where you basically have two. It allows you to basically have that tube that completely connects to your body and separates everything else from the external organ.
We'll talk more about that in a little bit.
Now, the diet, as we've mentioned, can dramatically influence the digestive tract structure. So ruminants such as elk, deer, cows, a lot of those things have what we call a rumen and a cecum. If you've ever heard the term four-chambered stomach, that's what that means. It's just the stomach being compartmentalized to all these different things. And what that does is allows it to move it through all these different compartments of the stomach, break it down more slowly, have more time to sit there and process things, as well as house really beneficial bacteria and things like that, that are then going to allow them to be able to break down the things that they can't break down themselves. Really important thing that I should talk about here is that a lot of organisms rely on the gut microbiome
In order to properly eat things. So for instance, I'm sure you may have noticed this if this happened to you. If you've ever taken a really strong dose of antibiotics or something, your stomach does not handle food to start kind of feeling normal again. What happened is that antibacterial regimen that you just went through killed off all of your gut microbiome, and now it has to be replenished. And if you don't have that done right, they have managed to come in and have massive infections as a result of boat strikes and things like that. And as a result, they give them high doses of antibiotics to kill off those infections, which is what you have to do, right? However, manatees, they don't do a good job of breaking down. So how do they break down all those? Around when you see that, they wait. Now, several different types of tissues make up the digestive system. I'm pretty sure you can name all four that make up the different types of tissues. Epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. Obviously, all of them have very, very different purposes within those. Everything from the epithelial cells, which are going to be there from everything from secreting hormones to trigger digestive actions to being there to absorb things, as well as connective tissues for all that structure, so they're also moving around, as well as nervous tissue to go and control how much food you need, all that kind of fun stuff. All interconnected with all these different types of tissues making up this organ and ultimately these organ systems. Don't have time for that today, unfortunately. Now, ultimately, all of these different organs are going to make up the digestive system. In the human digestive system, it's ultimately this gastrointestinal tract and all these accessory structures. So in the gastrointestinal tract, you have the mouth, which is there to mechanically break down food, the pharynx, which is going to separate the esophagus from the trachea, so that way you don't send food into your trachea and ultimately your lungs. You're going to have the esophagus itself, which is going to move food down into the stomach. The stomach is going to be there to mix food and mechanically and chemically break it down. The small intestines, which is going to have a little bit of enzymatic action, but it's going to primarily absorb a shit ton of nutrients. The large intestines, which is there to absorb water and minerals. And finally, the rectum, which is there to eliminate that feces after you're done with it, right? You're going to have all these accessory structures, like the salivary glands that rest in the mouth, help secrete saliva, as well as all those enzymes for chemically breaking things down. The liver, which is going to produce bile, which is there to help break down fat. The gallbladder, which is there to store and release bile as it's needed into the stomach. The pancreas, which is there behind the stomach, and it's going to produce and release digestive enzymes and bicarbonate ions in the small intestines to help things move along. And finally, the appendix, which is primarily useless to humans, but again, it's another way to store all of these different enzymes and have them ready at whenever you need them. So those, when it comes to accessory organs, they're going to make up kind of an odd part of the digestive system. They often kind of get overlooked. The salivary glands and pancreas typically secrete enzymes to digest food, while the liver and gallbladder are there to produce and store bile, which is again used for breaking down those fats, right?
Whereas all those gastrointestinal organs are there for ingestion and digestion, as well as absorption and elimination. They're the stars of the show, whereas kind of the accessory organs are there to kind of help move things along and produce particular chemicals. Yeah. You should know the individual organs. I know that sounds frustrating, but there's a reason for it. If you know what these things are, if you ever go to the doctor, you can actually understand what they're talking to you about. I use that example of that student last fall that took my class, who was having some very things that were kind of characteristic of having a thyroid issue. And the only reason they knew to ask was because they had taken this class and had thought about that. It's like, hey, I'm feeling really tired all the time and things just don't seem right. They asked about maybe it could be a thyroid issue, and they ended up getting tested, and that's what it was. So you just never know. And unfortunately, as much as doctors are pretty good, they do miss things if they don't know to look for things, you know? Now, ultimately, all this stuff is going to have smooth muscles that are going to underlie that digestive tract. That smooth muscle contraction is involuntary and stimulated by the autonomic nervous response. And ultimately, they're going to use rhythmic waves of smooth muscle contractions called peristalsis to move through your food in one direction through the digestive tract. Now, sphincters are going to be any of these muscular rings that can contract to block the passages of materials. There's one with the entrance and exit of the stomach, as well as primarily what's composed of the anus, and there's one, of course, in the mouth as well. These are all under voluntary control for the most part. And as a result, why we're not sitting here just shitting ourselves, right? As well as it keeps things like us from choking on our food and all that kind of fun stuff, sitting it down the wrong pipes. As well as if you get sick, ultimately there's an involuntary action, but still involuntary control of purging yourself, like, you know, throwing it up. That's all done through the basis of the nervous system's action. Now, like we mentioned earlier, digestion is going to be again in the mouth. There's specialized enzymes in the saliva that are going to begin the digestion of things like starch and turning it into those more basic sugar monomers. As well as your teeth are going to tear food into smaller pieces. The tongue is there to push through to the back of the mouth, and it's there going to be swallowed into the pharynx. And then that trachea is going to close and allow food to pass through to the esophagus into the stomach. Where digestion is going to then continue to occur. The stomach is basically just a muscular bag that receives that food from the esophagus, and its main function is there just to mechanically and chemically digest the food. Ultimately, this is going to result in these churning muscle contractions that are going to be there to mechanically digest the food. Whereas all those gastric juices are going to be full of enzymes that are there to help chemically digest things. Keep in mind too, your stomach is very, very special. On the inside of your stomach, you're going to have a highly specialized wall of mucus. That sounds gross. You're going to realize you have about somewhere between 0 to 2 is the pH of the acid that sits in the stomach. It's highly, highly acidic. Now, if you didn't have that mucus layer there, ultimately what can happen is those acid can wear into the lining, causing you to bleed. So when you're highly stressed, your body isn't able to make those that mucus lining as well as it normally can, and as a result, especially with high acid content, if you really automatic response to long continuous levels of stress, what results in furrowing that layer of stomach and Exactly. So you also asked if, you know, it's not just a stress thing there. Ulcers can occur when you're just not eating as much. And as a result, your body's not keeping up with the ability to keep. We still have that stomach just sitting there and ultimately the lining being after the stomach.
This might be like the size of the stomach actually affects how much you can digest food or is it not?
So, size of your stomach is probably valuable to how well and what you can process. Ask those individuals things like gastric sleeve, or an actual stomach reduction. That would lose the ability to process certain things. For instance, I have a friend that went through this
about 10 years ago. And they couldn't process any of the like really high, like simple carbohydrates. So things like beer, bread, any of that kind of stuff. They had to be extremely careful with how much they ate of it, because it would basically just cause their stomach to immediately reject it and they get sick. Whereas if over time you eat a lot of food, you can train your stomach to be very large. It's the muscle, right? You can stretch it, you can expand it. You can do things like right? And it continues to grow and expand. One, to be able to absorb a lot more food. Two, you can absorb a lot more food. Some people just usually have larger stomachs than others. Some of that's biologically controlled, genetically controlled, however you want to put it. And some of that is just, there's a lot of reasons why that could be the case just naturally. But usually you can, like every other muscle, kind of train it, right? If your heart can be trained to handle that higher load, your stomach can too. Just some things to think about. Now, the stomach is there to produce those gastric juices. When food is present, the specialized epithelial cells lining the inside of the stomach can secrete those gastric juices. And sometimes it doesn't always work correctly. And ultimately, these are going to contain enzymes, water, mucus, ions, and hydrochloric acid with a pH of about 1.5, which is stupid high, right? That's like eating through metal time. And ultimately, you're going to have that thick layer of mucus to prevent the stomach from digesting itself. Now, the stomach can absorb some nutrient. So the stomach passes what we call chyme, which is a semi-fluid mixture of food and gastric juices through the sphincter that ultimately is going to link the stomach to the upper part of the small intestines. And what the stomach can absorb is things like water and ions, and as well as a few drugs such as aspirin or alcohol. So ultimately, the small intestine is going to be there to digest and absorb nutrients. That small intestine is going to be a long tubular organ filled with a highly folded layer of epithelial cells. You can see examples of these giant folds that all these little specialized cells called villi. And on those villi, if you remember back to talking about all those different things that can be extracellular structures, the cilia, where the little hairs coming out of those cells, the villi have that, and that's what allows them to be able to kind of bring in those nutrients into the bloodstream. And just kind of like the roots of a plant, the more surface area you have to absorb things, the better. That's why each one of these, you have full bodies. So you have all these little injections that are.
I heard that like just trying to exercise and they're like the girls say that it has a deeper long, is that accurate?
It's pretty close. So keep in mind, I think it's a little bit long, but it's like 30 or 40 feet long. It's ridiculous if you think about it. If you were to just take your small intestines and string it out end to end, it's like 30 feet. And again, that's also, you have all that surface area to be able to absorb as much nutrients as possible. And again, that's all being driven by these intestinal villi, which are these tiny finger-like injections. You can see them way up here. That maximizes the absorption by greatly increasing that surface area, as well as kind of just giving it more space, right? And you can actually see the inside one. All these epithelial cells are in there to hold the nutrients, as well as the veins and arteries that are running right in there to be able to pick up stuff from anything that's generated inside of that cell. All right. I'm going to go ahead and call it a day here. We'll come back to this spot, start next lecture. Keep in mind when it comes to, we have a little bit of extra time built in because of that review.